Hey everybody, I think we'd like to get started. I appreciate everybody spending a little time with Rich and I this afternoon. Obviously, we would have liked to have done this in person to welcome Rich back to Wisconsin, but times are as they are. So we'll have to virtually welcome him. I appreciate everybody joining us today. Topic is obviously as relevant as ever. Conservatives, Republicans, opinions about renewable energy. I am particularly excited about this panel and about Rich's presentation. I was fortunate enough months and months ago to be able to sit in on one of his in-person kind of dial testing focus groups, and it's great information. It's great information. It's enlightening, and it is information that I think is going to be increasingly important from a political perspective, but also from renewable energy industry perspective. What kind of messaging we need to use to build a more broad base of support for this kind of technology, especially the development that's going to take place in Wisconsin and across the Midwest in the next 5 to 10 years. So to take a little time, just wanted everybody to kind of get the lay of the land here. During my presentation and Rich's talk, you all have the ability to go into the Q&A function and ask questions of both myself and of Rich. I'll be taking kind of a moderator role after Rich is done presenting, and we should have a little time for some questions and answers. So please feel free to use that as Rich goes through his presentation. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions that come up, and we will try to get to the questions that we can as we move forward. So to kind of kick things off, I just want to set the table for the conversation. Obviously, this is Monday of National Clean Energy Week. It's a good lift off to the whole week. So we wanted to focus a little bit on Wisconsin specifically, kind of present some Wisconsin specific information and set the table for this conversation. So you all kind of know who we are at Wisconsin Conservative Energy Forum. We were founded back in 2017, beginning of 2018. We are a group of conservatives, right? A group of Republicans, folks that have been involved in conservative state politics for a very, very long time in the state. But we want to approach this issue in a unique way, in a way that kind of builds bridges a little bit more and breaks the political lines down, as opposed to pushing things further apart. So our approach, and again, a lot of you know this, we want to be the conservative messenger. We want to be the free market messenger. We want to have a seat at the table in all of these discussions about new energy technologies. But really a lot of our focus is expanding what we think is the conservative definition of responsible resource development. And this is one of the things I think that Rich is going to touch on. What is that? What are the preconceived notions of responsible resource development in conservative primary voters' minds? And that's something that I think we really, really need to hit on. Apply conservative principles, but understand that energy markets are changing. So obviously, a conservative case for alternative energy as we go forward, and Rich, again, will touch on this, or whether or not it is the right message. We don't talk about subsidies, right? We don't necessarily talk about government mandates anymore. We certainly aren't really touching on climate or environmental benefits. Falling price, the versatility of new technologies, rural economic development could be huge for our state. Business and consumer choice, this stuff is in demand. Renewable energy is in demand from very large employers. Grid diversity, and then of course, huge benefits to national security, both as individual households, as states, and as the country. So that we think is conservative, it's business minded, it is an effective message, hopefully. We will find out. And just to kind of set the table again for this conversation, we all know it's renewable development in the state is going to be really, really broad-based. It is going to touch a lot of communities. It is going to be rural in nature, right? This is just one map of all the projects that we are tracking. And I know we're missing projects in this map across something like 25 different counties in the state, battery, wind, and solar projects. This kind of energy generation development, it's going to require a much, much more broad-based discussion than we're having, and it's going to require much more broad-based stakeholder group than we have right now, and particularly, again, right of center and conservative audiences. So a little bit of polling that can kind of guide our thinking on things a little bit. Conservative Energy Network did polling going into this primary in 2020, going into this primary season. Among Republicans, renewable energy is It polls well. It polls broadly well. About 59 to 60% of voters say they would support or be more likely to support a candidate that is open to clean energy, to renewable energy developments. It's even more popular as you move further to the center and left, obviously, is where you kind of find the passion on the subject. Something like 80% of voters are very excited about clean energy, are supportive of clean energy. I tend to be a little bit more skeptical on some of these poll numbers. I think you can poll people and they tend to press a button and say, yeah, I like clean energy. So we'll find out a little bit more, and Rich will dig in to, I think, some of these numbers and dig into some of the real granular detail of some of this stuff. So is renewable energy broadly popular? Absolutely. Do we still need to do a better job of messaging it and talking to people? I think absolutely as well. So we got to recognize the challenge and probably change some of the perception. Again, development in this state and across the Midwest in renewable energy, it's here now. It's going to be really broad. Rural voters are certainly more likely to be impacted, and that carries a connotation with it politically. Policy, any kind of policy changes that happen at the state level requires broad-based support, and especially in a purplish state like Wisconsin, it has to be bipartisan in nature. And that the nature of that requires us to talk and communicate with right of center voters on this thing. So where do perceptions stand right now? How can industry, utilities, stakeholders message these technologies to what right now seems like an unfamiliar audience? So with that, I will turn it over to Rich. I'm really, really excited about this. Rich has experience for years and years and years talking to real people, talking to voters about what they think about not just this issue, but lots and lots of different issues across the spectrum. So I'm very excited to get into this, and with that, I will turn it over to you, Rich.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's great to be with you all. Let me bring the presentation up. Before I start, I just want to mention that I love Wisconsin. And I love Wisconsin so much that to get myself through the pandemic, I've been eating Door County dried cherries for the last 6 months, bought in 5-pound bags. So just so you guys know, I don't buy them from any other state than Wisconsin. So it's great to be with you virtually. Again, I wish I were there in person. I would share my cherries with you. And Scott, thank you for having me today. Again, I wish I could be with you in person, but for organizing this, you and Joanna, I'm very grateful to you. So thank you. So let me dive right in and talk about the conservative case for clean energy and some of the message testing work that we did last year. So we did moment-to-moment dial tests within the context of 2-hour focus groups in 3 states. We were in Minnesota first in Edina and Rochester in early August, then St. Cloud in mid-September. In Wisconsin, we were in Appleton and Eau Claire. And then we went to Michigan, we were in Southfield and Grand Rapids. So we covered a lot of very interesting and diverse towns across the upper Midwest. In each state, we interviewed moderate and somewhat conservative suburban Trump voters and very and somewhat conservative rural Trump voters. That was our mandate. And what we did was we basically set up the dynamic of a fight within the family, if you will. 2 different, very different perspectives on clean energy represented by 2 different actresses. So Joan is basically the voice of you guys, conservative clean energy. Susan is the more traditional voice. She's basically sticking with what works, oil and coal. And she pays some, I guess I don't want to be too flip about it, a little bit of lip service to other forms of energy, but she's basically an oil and coal sounding person. So I want to describe to you what the people are like in the focus groups dispositionally. And this should sound familiar to some of you who spend a lot of time talking to conservative voters. So the first thing is they are conservative. They're both ideologically conservative and they're dispositionally conservative. These are folks who generally don't rush in and embrace change. They are late adopters of new technology, but they support it nonetheless. So when it comes along, they will embrace it, but they're not going to be the ones rushing out to take it first and to use it first. They are clearly not animated by ideological environmentalism. They are not like people on the left for whom this is a cause. This is not a cause for these folks. They are extraordinarily price sensitive. For a lot of them, not all, energy is energy. As long as they can afford it, it's okay. And they also don't want to see energy sources taken off the table. In other words, they are about and as opposed to or. They're not looking to swap out one energy source for another. They're looking to add additional energy sources to the mix. And they're skeptical of both big business and big government. So let me cut to the chase. You want to hammer home these points. And then after I tell them to you, we'll talk about how we derived all of this. The first is you have to reassure them energy has to be affordable as well as clean. If it's merely just clean and not affordable, they are not going to be interested. Second, recognize that they want their energy sources diversified. As I said just now, it's an issue of and, having more and a variety of sources and not just one or two. For them, clean energy standards are better than RPSs because there's more opportunity to get energy from different types of sources. Tout the virtues of nuclear, hydro, and carbon capture. Those are sources that they're generally very supportive of. And you want to endorse property rights to build conservative goodwill. If you sound too much like you're coming from the left, they won't trust you. So you need to sound as though you're conservative, and you are conservative, and to reinforce that, talking about property rights helps. And you want to watch out when you make a couple of claims. First is we need to get to 100% clean energy. As you'll hear in a little bit, that does not sound realistic. And just going endlessly in the camp of wind being awesome. There are some people who think it is awesome, but there's a bunch of conservatives who don't. And then obviously after that, I'll be happy to take your questions. So let me talk about the messages that resonate and why. One, it has to be affordable. I'm going to play a series of dial test clips, and let me explain to you what's going on here. Respondents used a pad with a knob on it that went from 0 to 100. 0 being they totally disagreed with what they heard. 100 is complete agreement with what they heard. We took a reading from every dial every second within the focus group, and the output looks like this, these squiggly lines on the screen. When we play a clip, focus between the two arrows on the right. That's where the new information comes in. Ignore where the lines are on the screen right now. That's the previous 30 seconds, and it doesn't matter. What matters is what happens when I play the clip. If the line moves up, it means on average the groups agreed more. If they drop, it means they agreed less, on average. Here's the rule of thumb. If the lines are above 70, you're generally in good territory. If you're above 80, you're in excellent territory. And if you're below 60, you're in real trouble. This is supposed to be persuasive messaging. And if you can't get to at least 60, then you're not making a persuasive argument at all. Let me play the first clip and watch between the arrows.
Low cost is really important for consumers. People can't afford expensive energy that happens to be clean. It has to be both clean and affordable.
I'll tell you, I do a lot of dial test work. You almost never get to 100. Full agreement from everybody in the group. You got to 100 among the conservatives in Grand Rapids and 96 in Southfield. So you cannot, this is arguably the single most important point when it comes to this topic. You need to be talking about affordability. So if clean energy isn't affordable, it's a total non-starter. The challenge that you face is a lot of these conservatives don't think it's fully affordable yet, but they're hopeful we can get there. Your challenge, as long as clean energy costs more than coal and natural gas, respondents will be open to your opponent's message of sticking with the status quo. Second point, energy sources have to be diversified. The all-the-above mindset totally predominates here. They support innovation and don't want to put all of their eggs in one energy basket. Let me play this next clip, give you a sense of how very conservative people think about this.
I'm all about looking at renewable energy, actually looking at it with my home right now, and doing some things, and no matter what you say, that's the way the world's going. whether we like it or not. Eventually it's going to be, you know, down with coal, and it's destroying the earth, and so we need to find better ways to do it. And and I don't think Joan was all for getting rid of coal and getting rid of natural gas and that kind of stuff. I think she had a valid point of it needs to be all of the above working together to build energy for everybody, in turn lowering our coal and our fuels that burn stuff, carbon and all that kind of stuff, and making it more clean and more energy efficient.
So there was a phrase that gentleman used that I just want to put a fine point on. He talked about this is the way the world is going, whether we like it or not. So it's that grudging acceptance. This is the way things are moving, and we just have to be willing to accept this. And he himself was trying to get a little bit ahead of it. I'll play another clip around this topic just so you get a better sense. Again, focus between the arrows.
For a stable electrical grid, we can't rely on only one source of energy. Diversity in our energy portfolio and competition among different energy producers will provide us with the flexibility we need to get affordable, reliable, and renewable energy.
So again, very, very effective messaging. Third point, clean energy standards are better than renewable portfolio standards. For the clean energy standards basically equate with flexibility. Respondents were much more supportive of clean energy standards than renewable portfolio standards. They like the flexible clean energy standards, the flexibility that clean energy standards provide, allowing the market to decide the best clean energy solutions rather than having government mandate.
A better way is to use a different set of standards called clean energy standards, which allows flexibility in clean energy choices. This lets the people and the markets decide, not government. It allows for a more diverse energy portfolio, one that includes nuclear, hydropower, and carbon capture natural gas. It allows utilities to choose the clean energy source that makes the most sense for their communities in terms of reliability, jobs, and electricity costs.
Again, very positively received. Fourth, tout the virtues of nuclear, CCS, and hydro. Most respondents were confident that nuclear, hydro, and carbon capture natural gas would be affordable and reliable. Feature them for these reasons. First, with nuclear, the plants last a long time, and they're becoming less costly to build. Carbon capture natural gas, it's producing cleaner energy. Hydro, it's clean, inexpensive, and reliable. Here's a collection of comments about the different energy sources in one master clip.
Nuclear can provide enormous quantities of affordable electricity around the clock. While it's expensive to build a nuclear plant, it's economical to run it once it's built. And a plant can run for 60 years or more. Because it's clean, reliable, and affordable, nuclear is an important piece of our energy portfolio. Natural gas provides about a quarter of Wisconsin's electricity. It's cleaner than coal and can be made even cleaner through carbon capture technology. Carbon capture traps carbon dioxide from the exhaust stream, then either stores it or transforms it into something else, like plastic or pharmaceuticals. Carbon capture natural gas is an important part of a dependable and affordable electric grid. Hydropower is clean, reliable, and really cheap. Wisconsin has a long history of building dams to generate electricity. The first hydroelectric plant in the world opened in 1882 right here in Wisconsin, in Appleton. Today, Wisconsin has 105 hydro facilities powering the equivalent of 241,000 homes. Once a dam has been built, hydropower plants run on free renewable energy, flowing water.
By the way, I know that that Michigan should not be the label in the bottom left-hand corner. That was my mistake, inserting that at the last minute. It was for the first clip in that series, but obviously not for all of them. Fifth, endorse property rights to build conservative goodwill.
Speaking of freedom, we have the right to use our property to pursue innovation. We have the right to lease our land for wind and solar generation. We have the right to buy clean energy generated by the power company and even contribute to the grid with the clean energy we produce ourselves but don't use.
Again, that whole construct, we have the right to do this, we have the right to do that, all about talking about rights, property rights, very powerful with conservatives. A couple other things that are effective messages. You have a vision for a clean energy future. Something like, let's pursue our clean energy future with the reasonable way, with diversity, with free market forces, and with innovation. Coal-fired electricity damages our health and our environment. Let's let people in the markets decide our clean energy future, not the government. Consumers will suffer if government mandates aren't implemented the right way. And clean energy will create jobs. A couple of watch outs. Some topics remain challenging to message effectively. The first is the idea of getting to 100% clean energy. Respondents were skeptical, and they called this a pipe dream. Fossil fuels will always play some part in supplying the energy we need, if only as a backup, as clean energy technologies continue to make advancements. Setting a government mandate to retire all coal plants by 2030, for example, could leave us, quote, stuck, they said, with, quote, unintended consequences if clean energy isn't yet able to stand on its own. Here's some comments about this from a group that we did in Wisconsin.
But the more I listened to Susan, the more I realized, well, yeah, we don't really know how fast we can get there. And if the technology is going to come, when it's going to come, that economic thing will always be there. People want to make money and innovation is great, but we can't sacrifice what we have right now and just without really knowing what's out there. It's just, I want all of that other stuff to happen, but it's just not there yet. And, you know, I guess I don't think I'm afraid by the word mandate, but it worries me more than Joan made me feel comfortable.
So again, you hear the hesitancy, the tentativeness. She kind of likes it, but again, she's not rushing all in. She wants to hold on to what we have right now. And then be aware that wind faces headwinds. They don't think it's cost competitive, and they've heard about problems associated with wind, maintenance hassles and costs, the challenges property owners experience, the relatively short useful life of 20 years for wind turbine. They tell us that the blades aren't recyclable, and there are even physical ailments for humans and livestock. Listen carefully to what these people said in Wisconsin when we talked about this. And again, these are the moderates.
I worked at J.J. Keller, and they have, what, 4 on their property off of 76? Mm-hmm. And I remember them talking a lot about how they weren't really producing enough electricity to really bat an eye at, and then there was 1 or 2 that kept breaking down. And so I've always been unsure of how good of an energy source they would be long term.
Well, what I was going to say was about the migraines and the spinning and that. I've heard of that.
From where?
From a farmer that had them on his land. They actually moved off the land.
He said there's a farmer that had sheep there, and all the sheep wouldn't produce anymore. It's like they couldn't stand the noise, and they just pretty much cost them there. They couldn't grow sheep anymore. Okay. And then the flicker effect is like taking half of these lights and shutting them off and turning them back on, and doing that repetitively. So it's not like a cloud just going by. It's a consistent flip in the shadow that those things cast. Is quarter mile, half mile long, when the sun is rising or setting.
They were constantly having breakdowns. You had a breakdown, it wasn't just a matter of calling a repairman, you had to have somebody that could climb a tower, and they had to come from the Twin Cities. And you had that expense, and that negated all of this.
So again, a lot of very specific examples that they give of issues surrounding wind. One other clip about this.
Wind power is abundant, clean, and affordable. It's cheaper than coal, and sometimes cheaper than natural gas.
So again, no, it's not cheaper. They don't think it's cheaper. They think that erecting a wind turbine or a whole field of them is expensive. So it's not something that they just think, wow, it's cheap because it just keeps turning and producing free energy. Similarly here.
10% of Wisconsin's electricity comes from renewable sources: wind, solar, hydroelectric, and biomass. Wind technology continues to get more efficient, reliable, and cost competitive. Wind energy powers the equivalent of 172,000 Wisconsin homes and provides jobs in manufacturing, construction, installation, and maintenance. It provides benefits to local economies and income supplements for farmers who lease their land for turbine siting.
So again, some skepticism among the conservatives, the moderates you had from start to finish there. A couple other points of ineffective messaging, one being China is developing and exporting more clean energy than any other country. This, on the face of it, sounds preposterous to people, because when people think of China, they think of dirty energy, they think of pollution. So the idea that they're doing this and are so ahead of us just does not comport at all with their view of how China operates. Their view of China is sort of like Pittsburgh in the 1950s. The idea also that they rejected was that high-polluting countries will want to buy the clean energy technologies that we develop. The fact of the matter is they say high-polluting countries are high-polluting for a reason. They don't care about their environment, so they're not going to spend any money to clean it up. I want to say also that the people who are defending the status quo on the right don't own the high ground. Let me just show you one clip from them, and you get a sense of how this is received.
We should stand behind coal and natural gas and let solar and wind take a back seat.
So, nosedive there. Again, because for the conservatives in particular, it's about all. We want to have all of the above. They don't want just one or two sources. They want a whole wide variety of them. Just to quickly recap, hammer home these points, reassure them energy has to be affordable as well as clean, recognize they want diversification, clean energy standards are better than renewable portfolio standards, tout the virtues of nuclear, hydro, and carbon capture, endorse property rights to build conservative goodwill, watch out around 100% clean energy. 100% is the issue, not the clean energy, and that wind energy is awesome. There are some real issues that people have with it. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have, and I'll let Scott field them.
Yeah, so anybody, any of the attendees on the call here, please just head down to the little Q&A button there at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to send some questions in. We've got a couple here that I'd like to start off with, and please, we'll take all questions as we get them. So, one of the things, Rich, that I thought was interesting right off the bat, obviously recognize, again, we probably need to do, as stakeholders, as industry folks, maybe need to do a better job of messaging to people. Obviously, there's some, around cost issues and, things like that. Big changes in the market in just the last 5 years. It's understandable that people who don't spend all day thinking about energy, probably are not up to date on the latest levelized cost of sources or things like that. But, a question for you, did you get a sense at all for voters, who do they trust to communicate on these issues? What sources of information, do they trust, are they listening to their utility? Are they listening, to maybe a local state representative, or, who, I guess, did you get a sense for who do they trust on these issues and where are they going for information?
That's a great question. So, the person that they trust is not someone who's supporting this type of energy for the most part, and that's the president. So that's where you have the challenge, right? And in fact, in many ways, he makes this even more challenging given the skepticism that he levels against certain parts of the clean energy sector. But I don't have a simple sort of a magic bullet on this. I think to take a portion of your question, Scott, I would say is that a lot of them are not listening to anybody on it. It's not as though they are particularly well versed in the topic, that they particularly understand it. So honestly, I can't say for sure that their knowledge base is all that great, other than that they hear little bits and pieces floating in the ether. So I don't have an answer. That's something actually that would merit additional research, which is who would they trust? I mean, there is certainly some trust of the utility, but they also understand that there's a self-interestedness in this, right? I mean, it's the utility's in it. They're trying to bring in revenue, and so I think they question some of that. But the thing is, I cannot think of a single famous conservative clean energy advocate that they would all look at and go, oh, he or she, I'm with that person. That I know that they've said it, therefore I need to pay attention to it. I think from an effort to try to bring more conservatives in, having that advocate, a prominent advocate, if you had Sean Hannity talking about this, or Tucker Carlson talking about this, or any of the leading Republicans in the Senate who are thinking of running for president talking about this prominently, it would start to become really, really a different type of conversation. The fact that it's happening in the absence of that as opposed to the presence of it is definitely a shortcoming. So I would encourage anybody working on this to try to solve.
I will send Tucker a text message after this. No, so to drill in on that for a second, did you get a feeling? So we kind of heard some of the private property rights. We heard a little bit on the messaging about generating my own electricity, that kind of thing. Did you pick up any tension between investor-owned utilities and that kind of thing, and the ability to go off on my own, and kind of do you see some tension there, or did you get the feeling that voters were aware that there is kind of there's a difference of incentive there, right? And there's inherently a little bit of tension with my own electricity generation or my own independence and the utility that serves the community.
So that's where you start getting into the lack of nuance in all of this, right? You just made a very nuanced point, which anybody working in the sector would be appreciative of, right? But the garden variety people I spoke to across the upper Midwest didn't necessarily appreciate that. So you'd get into conversations with them, and they would think, well, solar has to be really expensive, because for me to put solar panels on my roof is going to cost me $15,000 or $20,000 or $30,000, as opposed to, oh wait, the utility has a solar array, and I can get solar power that way. They don't think about that. There's this very direct correlation between the power and how it's generated. And so they have a hard time envisioning something being affordable on a grand scale when they're not aware that grand scale exists and that they can benefit from it. That's just a connecting the dots process, where they go, I didn't realize that I could get wind or solar energy from my utility. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like when people think, do you want solar panel? The issue is, well, what's it going to cost me to stick it on my roof? Do I want wind power? Well, I'm not sure I have enough land to put a turbine up in my backyard. It's a literal mindedness to it. That connection just doesn't, I don't think it exists very well.
Yeah. So if you go back for a second, and this, Rich, feel free to not even limit this to just clean energy. Some other topics are out there as well. you mentioned having a figurehead or having a spokesperson, right? Or somebody, you know, with real credibility, probably a national audience. You know, what is the most effective way you find to communicate with people about a nuanced topic like this, about a topic that's kind of in the weeds? People don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. You know, are numbers, are the statistics really important for folks, or, you know, does it help us as industry or stakeholders? You know, can we sell a good story to people, right? I saw the story about wind turbines in there, right? You know, about sheep not producing and about headaches and flicker. You know, those are all very visceral stories, obviously in the opposite direction. You know, how can the industry, I guess, maybe seize on, you know, some of those more positive stories? Is that the effective way to go about it?
Yeah, to me, so the story has to be simple. I would not get caught in the nuance. It's the old saying in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. So you don't want to be in a position where you're endlessly explaining this stuff. You need, to me, the key to success in political and policy messaging, it's the Venn diagram. It's where your arguments and your values intersect with your audience's values. So all the stats in the world are meaningless unless people who you're talking to think that you share their values. And if they don't think you're sharing their values, they will completely tune you out. They'll think you're trying to put one over on them. So where are your values fitting with theirs? Well, I just took you through a list of messaging points that you could expand upon that would cause people to think, you share their values. You want it to be affordable. Affordability is important to people. It means that you're looking out for their well-being. You know, again, I did this work before the pandemic. People were even more economically stressed than they were before. We're in the midst of a severe recession right now. We weren't when I did this work. I imagine that the price sensitivity is off the charts right now. Mm-hmm. So for you to try to explain to people things that go beyond the issue of how much it costs, if you can't, to me, the opening salvo is, I've got a form of energy that is going to cost less than what you're paying right now. Until you can make that argument, this is an unbelievably heavy lift. And it's been one of the challenges so far. And I'll just say one other quick thing around this, Scott. Many years ago, I did work for the ClearPath Foundation. I'm on their advisory board. They promote conservative clean energy around the country. And I did some in-depth interviews with solar owners in Phoenix who were all conservative. And I learned something very valuable in those conversations. I said to each of them, you know, clean energy is often associated with a liberal cause. Do you feel like you're doing something that's particularly liberal by having solar panels on your roof? And they said to me, you have got to be kidding me. We live in Phoenix. It's sunny here 300 days a year. These panels pay for themselves within a couple of years. I'd be an idiot not to have solar panels on my roof. So what mattered to them? Ideology didn't mean a damn thing to them. What meant to them was that they were saving money. And if they could have had a coal-burning power plant on their property that would have saved them even more, they would have taken the solar panel off the roof and created the coal-generating power for their house that way. This was all about dollars and cents. So I think we get, you know, people on the left, this is a cause. People on the right, this is not a cause. This is just, tell me how I can do it cheaper than I was doing it before, with less hassle.
So let's get in for a second on that. I've thought about this before when I talk to some audiences. Sometimes I think there's almost a counterproductive nature to the passion behind this issue on the left. There's an equal and opposite reaction in the other direction sometimes, right? So, you know, on policy specifically, you touched a little bit with the group about they're obviously uncomfortable with what you would think of as traditional left of center policy ideas, right? The mandates, you know, very uncomfortable with government imposed deadlines, you know, that kind of thing. You know, policy, I guess, and you touched on environmental standards or clean energy standards versus, you know, a traditional RPS. You know, were there some other policy that you saw pop up in your conversations, or some other things that you think, you know, conservatives were open to, or maybe even a little bit excited about, I guess?
The excitement is in the ability to have around the property rights issue, mm-hmm. which is that you should be able to do, if you want to generate your own energy, then you should be able to do that. And the utility shouldn't stand in the way, and the government shouldn't stand in the way. That's what your right is. So that was something that they got excited about because, again, it comported with their worldview. And the other thing is also promoting basically the all of the above strategy. The idea that they didn't want to get rid of certain forms of energy. This whole idea that you're going to get rid of oil and coal, you're going to replace it with solar and wind, they thought it was dangerous. So the idea that you're going to promote, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let every form of energy compete in the marketplace, let's pick the ones that are cheapest. But then again, that plays to a conservative mindset, which is competition, fair competition. And you don't want to put your thumb on the scale for one form of energy over another.
So in general, Rich, an interesting question that pops up on this, your advice on this, should messaging on this issue be used to sell good policy from a conservative perspective, or should that policy really be developed with the messaging in mind, right? What do you think is more doable for that kind of audience?
Well, so they can't be divorced from each other. That is probably one of the shrewdest questions anybody has ever asked me about this. So kudos to you for thinking about it that way. The fact of the matter is that the energy sources are the energy sources, and you're kind of limited to what they are. It's not as though you could say, wow, I've got this amazing message, and if only I could create an energy source that would fit this messaging. Mm-hmm. It just, the world doesn't work that way. You're kind of stuck with the alternatives that you have. The one thing messaging-wise that I know works incredibly well is innovation and calling for innovation. So it's sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card, both on the left and on the right. It's a unifying message across the ideological spectrum. Everybody likes innovation. Nobody gets up in the morning and goes, gee, we shouldn't innovate. We should keep things exactly the way they are for the next 100 years. Like no reasonable person thinks that way. So I think that being able to promote innovation is fine, and then putting the new technologies you're developing in that innovation box helps get you there. So that's what I would be thinking about conceptually. Yeah. But you can't say, well, here's the messaging point, and let's find the policy to fix it when the policy rooted in technology doesn't enable you to support that message. You can't lie and say that a clean energy thing is a dirty energy thing, or a dirty energy thing is actually a clean energy thing. People will call you on it. At some point, the BS meter goes off, and people just say, you lied to me. They can't trust you anymore.
So going back for a second, could you detail for a second again, Rich? A couple of folks have asked, how did you select the audience? What did the audience look like? And particularly, I know you did 2 specific locations in Wisconsin, right? How did you come about the moderate audience or the more conservative? What was that process like? Yeah,
so basically what we did was that we used recruiting companies. There are focus group recruiting firms around the entire country and in your state and in others. They have databases of people who fit certain criteria. We create what's called a screener. It's a series of about a dozen questions that helps us make sure that we have roughly equal numbers of men and women, people of different ages, people who have a certain voting or ideological background. So people had to fill out, they went through the screener. And so we made sure that we didn't have any liberals in the groups. We had people who basically self-described as moderate to somewhat conservative or somewhat to very conservative. And that's how the people were chosen. They were invited to participate. They were told to, once they were accepted, they were told they would be paid. Each of those folks got $100 for showing up, and a turkey sandwich for dinner.
Okay, so knowing that, obviously, did you guys touch at all on the environmental message or climate change? Did you say that word at all during, that phrase at all during, because we've kind of approached this always, and I'm a fairly large believer in removing the renewable energy discussion from the larger climate change discussion because it's obviously still divisive, right? Did you touch on that at all, tying some of the environmental benefits, perceived benefits, to these technologies?
So again, it's been a while since I looked at the actual scripts. So you'll forgive me if I misrecall this, but to the best of my recollection, we talked about the health aspects of having cleaner energy and less pollution. We really did not spend time talking about climate, and I think we deliberately did that because we really wanted to talk about the whole idea of clean energy as a in and of itself, and the virtues that it provided and the ones we talked about there. I can tell you from work that I've done, I've been in this space now, working extensively for 6 years. And as a general rule, the moment you walk into a room of conservatives and you say to them, tonight we're going to talk about climate change and how we're going to solve it, they're squirming in their chairs, they're itching to get out, they don't want to talk about this topic. Now, has it changed a little bit in 6 years? Yeah, a little bit at the margin. Moderates are more willing than very conservative people to do it. But it's a highly polarizing issue. So the thing that brings people together, left, center, and right, is like, let's talk about a clean energy future. What kind of future do we want for our kids and grandkids? And position it that way. And if you're insistent or someone forces you to talk about climate in the context of the clean energy conversation, focus on clean energy first, talk about the virtues, and then say, if you happen to care about this climate thing, well, you know, it'll help with that too. But I would not put climate in the center of this conversation. It doesn't help, and it just puts people off and puts them on the defensive. And it puts them on the defensive because it forces them to think that you're going to ram Al Gore's solution for the future of the world down their throat. And they don't want it. So to make people more willing to listen, posit a positive future rooted in clean energy that's affordable, that'll be great for their kids and grandkids. And if there are problems that they think are going on right now that this solution can help solve, do it. Oh, let me just one other very quick thing on this, Scott. It's really important. I work on a whole host of issues and do message testing across them. On every issue I've worked on over the last nearly 20 years, the construct has been problem and then solution. It makes sense. You talk about the problem first, get people, okay, I agree that's a problem, now let's talk about the solution. This is the only issue that I work on where it is exactly backwards, where you basically, rather than 1 + 1 = 2, it's 2 - 1 = 1. You start off with the solution, which is I want a clean energy future because it has all of these great attributes. And then from there, if you need to, you back into the problem. Because the solution is unifying, the problem is polarizing.
Yeah. So that speaks to another problem, quote unquote, or at least maybe a difference again between passion, two sides, and maybe an issue that's further down on the priority list for right of center voters. Where do you think the urgency comes from for a conservative here, right? Where does the urgency to get into or become interested? Obviously there's an economic benefit, right? If you can talk dollars and cents and, an individual economic benefit, that's a big selling point. But we know where the passion and the urgency comes from on the left. It comes from the problem, right? They, recognize that problem. Is there any kind of equal force that you picked up right of center on this issue?
So I'm going to give you the answer you don't want, which the answer is no. I have not seen equal passion on this. This is a lower priority issue for most of these folks. Again, if you're not trying to solve the mystery of climate change and you don't feel the moral imperative to do that, this issue becomes far less pressing. So that's where you have a challenge. And I haven't figured out a way to solve that, other than if government's trying to take away your right to such and such related to energy production or choice of energy, and you don't want them to take that away from you, and you can posit that realistically, then maybe people will get a little bit more animated about it. But people are, we know from behavioral science that people are more animated by the prospect of a loss than they are from a comparably sized gain. Meaning, if you take away $500 from someone, they're going to be really angry at you. You give somebody $500, they're going to love you. But the intensity of the loss will be felt basically twice as acutely as the benefit of the gain. So liberals feel the loss. They feel the loss of the planet and their way of life and civilization. And they're carrying that and they're feeling it acutely. So that's why they're fighting for this. People on the right, like, okay, you want to develop clean energy over the next several decades? Sounds good. If I can afford it, I'll buy it. But they're not going, oh my God, you're taking something away from me. I got to fight to the death. I mean, think about how this issue fits against like Second Amendment. You're going to take away my guns. Sign me up. How do I fight that? Right? So that you don't have that comparatively here. And that's the challenge that everybody on this call is dealing with. Right? is that intensity just for most conservatives is not there. I certainly did not hear an intensity of feeling in these focus groups.
Yeah. So across the states that you did in the Midwest, Michigan, obviously, Wisconsin, and on the way over to Minnesota, you know, any discernible differences or, you know, anything that stuck out to you as a surprise in Wisconsin, wasn't an issue in Minnesota, you know, that kind of thing?
You know, in Wisconsin, there was a really strong positivity about hydro. I remember standing out. I can't explain to you necessarily. The thing that was, you know, a bit more consistent was, I think across the three locations, was the greater skepticism about clean energy overall among the very conservative people as opposed to the more moderate conservative people across all three states, which kind of is intuitive. You saw that a little bit in the dial test responses. And you know, the moderates, I think, are just, again, they're not gravitating to a left-leaning argument, but you don't necessarily have to pass as much of a, I want to be careful how I say this, purity test with the moderates that you do with the conservatives. Conservatives tend to be looking for conservative reassurance that you're actually the conservative that you say that you are. It's not as imperative to do that with moderates because they're not as conservative. So, you know, having the verbiage about, you know, the property rights, for example, with diehard conservatives, that really matters.
As you saw, just from even like an industry perspective or renewable deployment, so Wisconsin's further behind Michigan and Minnesota both, right? So, you know, I think those states are building more capacity. They just are, and this stuff might be in the headlines a little bit more. You know, local communities are starting to put this stuff up more, et cetera, et cetera. You know, did you see voters in either one of those states maybe a little bit more knowledgeable, or, you know, did you pick up any kind of, they knew about it more?
No, I mean, that's the thing that's so intriguing about this, is that unless you're working on the issue or you're employed in that sector, the knowledge levels are not that different. And we heard a lot of consistent responses, state across state across state. They really are not familiar with what's happening in their state. They're learning for the first time that there is a CES or an RPS that's being debated. It's not, again, I know you guys work in this field, so I feel badly telling you all this, but as a practical matter, that most people are just not familiar with what's happening on energy policy in their state. It's not a high enough priority. They know what they're paying in energy bills and what their utility's charging. They know it if there is a solar array or a windmill farm, you know, that they pass on the highway. But for most of them, there's not a huge knowledge base. It's kind of like they're living their lives, and unless they see it, it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, I know we have to wrap this up really quickly, but I think that honestly, you know, to drive home the first question, you know, who do voters trust and where do they come for information on this issue is really going to be, I mean, that's critically important going forward, right? I mean, if there is maybe a lower level of interest, not as much passion, kind of a, you know, lower priority issue for a lot of folks, you know, what matters is what they do here and where they are hearing it from. That is going to be really, really critical as we go forward. You know, who do voters trust, and, you know, where are they going to get that information? Yeah, absolutely. And so it's a real question also depending on who the next president is and how it's positioned. And one thing that does intrigue me about this is how Joe Biden said, and I watched him on CNN the other night, talk about when you know, Trump thinks about climate change, he thinks it's a hoax. When I hear about climate change, I think jobs. So to me, you're now going to have potentially, if Biden wins, and who knows who's going to win, I think it's a toss-up. At the end of the day, if Biden does win, he's going to reposition this entire clean energy conversation about jobs. And I would ask strategically, if you're thinking about this in the state, well, are you going to be making the same kind of argument? Because I know the jobs argument obviously does work for people who are unemployed and where the economy is stressed.
or is there a way you want to distinguish yourselves as conservatives that sort of accept the fact that having more jobs is a good thing, but maybe there's a way that you would do it where maybe there's less government intervention in the job creation? Just, think about, I would try to start to plan ahead on how you position yourselves, both in the state and nationally in this larger conversation, because it's not going anywhere.
Well, I really appreciate it, Rich. Thank you. Thank you again. I know if I speak, we didn't get to all the questions, obviously, so I'd be happy, if folks on the call, would like to have a more in-depth conversation, please reach out to me, and we'd be happy to have a conversation in the future about this, find some answers to your questions. I appreciate, thank you, Rich, for taking this time.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, CEN, and it's an honor to have had all of you. Need to reach out to me, please, directly. Please do it, or through Scott. I'd be honored to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you all. We really appreciate it. Thanks.